So thank you so much for that introduction. I feel as though I don't need to speak now, and we can just go straight to Q&A. I wanted to start by thanking the organizers and Victoria for inviting me here. It's such a pleasure to be here to give this lecture. I'm very honored. So today's talk is drawn both from the book Habitual New Media, which I've hopefully just completed, as well as the new edition of New Media, Old Media, History and Theory Reader. And I'll talk a little more detail about habitual new media, but I wanted to offer you all, especially for those who haven't read the chapters that I sent, a frame of both projects and what brings them together. So these projects are focused quite modestly on changing the terrain of new media criticism, on indeed changing what counts as critical or what counts as new. Now, the conceit we're all familiar with, and I apologize, I have so many devices, I usually walk around, so I might walk with these devices, it helps me to think. So the conceit that we're all familiar with is that new media exist at the bleeding edge of obsolescence, right? They're exciting when they're demonstrated, they're boring by the time they arrive. Everyone in the Valley knows that you live and die by the demo. What this means is perversely, that if a product does what it promises to do, it fails, right? And if an analysis is interesting or definitive, it's allegedly too late. By the time we understand something, it's already changed, right? So we're forever trying to catch up, updating to remain close to the same, bored, overwhelmed, and anxious all at once. Now, in response, criticism has either focused on the future, the next best thing. So criticism itself has become very speculative in the age of speculative capitalism. Or it's focused on proving that new media aren't really new, right? As though we could all agree on what the new is or does, as if the new itself didn't have a history, one very much linked to the question of the Enlightenment and colonialism, right? So think of the term the New World. So now against these trends, habitual new media, old media, argue that what's remarkable is not that new media are called into question, but rather that they continually resurge even as they disappoint. Right? So soon after the dot-com meltdown, which seemed to end the term new media, right? Social media emerged as the new promise, right? And Web 2.0 promised a new beginning, a new future, albeit not one as glorious as the web, right? That needed no numerals after it to qualify it. But if you think about it, Web 2.0 also promised that the web would never die, right? That every downturn could be treated as temporary, as a call for an update to renew, Web 4.0, et cetera, et cetera. So that if the digital does induce a certain vertigo, a confused and confusing sensation of whirling round and round, it's not simply because we're moving perpetually, it's not simply because new media are too fast, but rather because we're simultaneously accelerating and decelerating. That is because of the constant changes in direction that immobilize us, that make us remain manically the same. If we remain, it's by being manically engaged in a certain action. So constant changes in direction that we engage in. And think of the term revolution, right? Revolution itself is this idea of a whirlwind turn back to the same spot. One revolves 360. Think here of chain emails that never die, and that we don't understand at all if we think of them as viral. And here you see the computer scientists Lynne Knoll and John Kleinberg's diagram of the spread. And if these chain emails were truly viral, this diagram would be short and fat. It would spread and die. They embody what I've called the undead of information because of our habits of responding, because we respond asynchronously. So habit as a way to mediate virality.
Think here of the ubiquitous update. So we're constantly reminded to update our software, not only to remain up to date, but also to remain period, to remain viable or secure. And in this sense, hackers are the best thing that ever happened to software companies, right? Because out of the fear of hackers, we're constantly downloading the latest version of corporate spyware, right? And this ubiquitous update expands beyond software because increasingly to be is to be updated, to be both subject of and subject to the update. People no longer updating are people in trouble. Things no longer updated are things no longer cared for. To be is to be updated because crises become ordinary, drive updates. As Lauren Berlant has argued, the present is now an impasse, a cul-de-sac, and the ordinary a landfill for overwhelming and impending crises, whose sheer volume so threatens what it is meant to have a life that adjustment seems like an accomplishment, right? So to update is to survive, if not to thrive. And Lauren Berlant defines cruel optimism as a double bind. So it's precisely because we hold on to dreams of the good life that the very possibility of a good life is undermined, but without these dreams, we couldn't survive. So trying to think here in terms of new media perhaps as a form of cruel optimism. Or to put it slightly differently, if new media are new, they're new as in constantly renewed. And new doesn't simply mean wondrous for the first time, but also contains within itself repetition, right? So new is coming as a resumption or repetition of some previous act or thing, starting afresh, right? To make it new is a stock modernist phrase, and it exemplifies the kind of repetition enabled by the new, right? So the transformation of something already known into something wonderful, strange, and empty, right? So the new is fresh, further, additional, restored after demolition, decay, disappearance, etc. But new as in renewal is also new as decay, right? To call something new is to guarantee that it will one day be old. To call something new is to guarantee it will one day be trashed, right? New media is filling the landfills and poisoning them, right? To call into question new media as new, to simply critique it and to point out how it's really old, is that's not even close to good enough. Right? Because this twinned boredom and excitement is not simply a response to new media. It's itself produced by new media. Right? So anticipation coupled with knowing disappointment is key to new media's ephemerality and its endurance. The seduction and significance of new media, that is, lie in its combination of boredom and excitement. Just as the novel quickly became anything but novel, yet remained the novel, right? New media, even after newness has faded, remains in ways that shape our imagination, our politics, and our everyday life. We need to grasp, and here I'm going to repeat what was said, the paradoxical lives and deaths of new media. Indeed, the paradoxes of new media more generally. Its enduring ephemerality, its visible invisibility, its exposing empowerment, its networked individuation, and its obsolescent ubiquity. That is, and this is something that grounds the new book, new media can't survive if they really are new, wondrous, strange for the first time, right? As many marketing studies have shown, people regularly ignore new commodities, which is why grocery stores do this thing that really annoys me, and they periodically redo the entire store, right? So you'll notice the new commodity, right? So habituation dulls us to the environment. Habituation, that is both the dream and the nightmare of new media companies, as is the new itself. And it's this oscillation between the new and the habitual that's so fundamentally ungrounding, which is turning habit, which once meant to have, into addiction, addictio, to lose. So again, in habitual new media, I argue that new media matter most when they seem not to matter at all, when they've moved from the new to the habitual. And think here of something like Google search, right? Whether or not you find Google search to be profound or interesting, it profoundly shapes our relationship to research. Think about sites that have long since disappeared or we think have disappeared, like Friendster.com. Anyone remember on Friendster.com? It's still alive as a South Asian gaming site, but it lives on in and continues to shape our relationship to social media. And BlackBerries, they're not what they used to be, sadly. But they live on in the notion of phantom vibrations, right? Not everyone has a BlackBerry more, but we all get phantom vibrations. So new media is ubiquitously obsolete. It's ubiquitous in its obsolescence. For these media, new media live on in our habits, right? So repetition breeds expertise even as it breeds boredom. And through habits, we become our machines. We click, stream, update, capture, upload, share, grind, link, verify, map, save, trash, and troll. At the same time, though, even as we become habituated to and inhabitants of new media also seeks to undermine the very habits it also establishes to be successful in order to be successful. So again, habituation and the new as both the dreams and nightmares of new media companies, and habit plus crisis equals update. Okay, but the point that I make in the book, and which I'd like to make here, albeit obliquely through a critique of silence and participation, is that this rewriting, this linking of habituation and the new also fundamentally changes habit. It changes what habit and habituation is and does. So habit is resurging in all these disciplines, from advertising to philosophy, but they're usually discussed in terms of how to change them. You have to know habits in order to change them. Habits are dependencies rather than things that offer shelter. Now, since I only have 50 minutes for the entire talk, I'll continue to be telegraphic and condensed, but the rest of the talk will swirl around this formula, habit plus crisis equals update. But more specifically, I'll outline the remarkable and bizarre transformation of digital media into new media, endlessly renewed media, and also think through this dizzying perpetual motion in terms of what seems to be its opposite, namely silence. And I want to think through what silence can be, and is there even silence as a possibility now. So part one, again, new media again, right? So digital media became new media, the promise of the future, the marker of progress in the mid-1990s with the emergence of the internet as a mass media to end mass media, to replace the mass with the new, the mass with the you. And the term new media, which itself is always on the verge of its own obsolescence, right? It's always a sort of embarrassing and exhausting term. We've always been trying to get rid of the term new media, right? New media displaced more friendly terms like multimedia, which seemed like all these media could live together, or digital media, which emphasized process. But the newness of new media didn't coincide with the newness of technology. Computers and networks had been around for a long time when the internet became new media. The newness of new media coincided with the massive deregulation of the US telecommunications industry. So new media became new when it became fictional, right? When it became the new frontier, conflated with something it was absolutely not, namely cyberspace, right? And there's stark differences between Gibson's fiction, which coined the term cyberspace and the matrix, and the internet itself, right? So for all of you who've read Neuromancer, it's clear he wrote it on a typewriter while going to a lot of arcade games, and he himself was profoundly disappointed when he got his first computer, right? It was that whirring hard drive, was very alienating, right? So little or nothing connects the two besides a common fan base. And that is, and this is something I've argued in Control and Freedom, the idea of digital media as progress, as inevitable progress, had everything to do with a bad, yet not entirely unfaithful reading of cyberpunk fiction, in which political problems became problems that technology could and should solve. Right? And race, the notion of race as skin deep, was central to this transformation. So the alleged bodilessness of cyberspace became the solution to racism. And so let me just show you one influential commercial.
People here communicate minds to minds. There is no race. There are no genders.
There is no age.
No age.
There are no infirmities. There are only minds.
Only minds.
Utopia?
No.
Internet. Doors and minds open up.
Right, so this was just one commercial of many, and in the mid to late 1990s, it seemed impossible to advertise the internet without featuring happy people of color saying that they were on the internet. And let me just note, not only does this commercial imply that racism naturally stems from bodily difference, right? So the message of this commercial isn't even don't be racist, right? It's get online if you want to avoid being discriminated against, right? So there's also a paranoid logic to these commercials. And in the late 1990s, not only were there not a lot of people of color online, this demographic was not representative, there weren't a lot of people online, period, right? So most insidiously, the message was get online because these people already are. You should want it because it's already something that others have. And remarkably, through this paranoid logic, the progressive stance towards technology, remember the 80s, anti-nuclear, the sort of fear of nuclear war that was in Neuromancer? The progressive attitude toward technology moved from progressive stance towards technology moved from an anti-technology position to one that was pro-technology. To an embrace of technology as the solution to political problems. And this was clear in Grateful Dead lyricist John Perry Barlow's declaration of the independence of cyberspace, right? So cyberspace was free because we come from cyberspace, a new home of the mind. So it was a time in '92 when some could declare without too much cynicism that they were creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice accorded by race, economic power, military force, or station of birth. We're creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. So just note that. The assumption is that if one is silent, one is coerced into silence and conformity. So the basic promise of cyberspace was this. On the internet, you're free because no one knows who you are, right? And that's a good thing. The internet was a free space because online our inner authentic selves could coincide and finally be revealed because finally our bodies no longer mattered. And thus democracy, true democracy, democratic dialogue, true equality could finally be realized. Now, as I've argued elsewhere, this is a really bizarre understanding of the internet, both of the benefits and the dangers of the internet. So given the public and promiscuous exchange of information that makes possible the internet, given that the internet is a control protocol, how on earth did we ever think of the internet as an anonymous space, right? How on ever did we think of it as an anonymous space of freedom? So to repeat something I've been saying for years, new media is not simply about leaks. New media is leaked. New media are leaky. New media work technically, socially, by breaching and thus bizarrely sustaining the threshold between public and private. New media are wonderfully creepy. They're wonderfully creepy. And they're wonderfully creepy because our machines work by leaking. And this point is made really beautifully clear by this video by Men in Gray. So I'm going to play part of it.
At the nodes of the network, computers which are of a multiplex class, essentially a major computer utility, which is capable of manipulating information, because the network itself doesn't hold information, doesn't keep information. It's an important design criteria, in fact.
And to my mind, this implies the packet switching principle. It requires that the terminals interconnect at the level of messages and not at particular speeds. Well, clearly, a public switch network is needed.
We're able to dynamically reconfigure one of these multi-computer simulations by ordering the simulation program for one particular area to move into another computer.
Has been discovered. Ivan laptop has been discovered.
Will make possible much more efficient and reliable use of computers. Research now going on will someday permit a network user to log in and not really care where his computation takes place.
Ego Gina Takaja Vertic Postica, use iPods, Kelly Yates said, he's wearing the red hooded and he's gritted. Trisha Rahman said, ask him out, you only live once, lol. Venicientando Fedico, Seguro, Bianco Testo Kina 94211. Lamp has been discovered, toast. Carlos MacBook has been discovered, toast. Ivan laptop has been discovered.
We are the direct manifestation of a citizen's network anxiety.
So, and they're just exposing, the fundamental leakiness and promiscuity of networks. So your network card reads in all data and then actively deletes what's not directly addressed to it. So your card works promiscuously whether or not it's in promiscuous mode, right? It constantly reads and writes. So your card is monogamous if it is, and tellingly promiscuous mode, not monogamous mode, is a technical term, right? This is what one does with one's wireless cards. Your card is monogamous if it is because your network card discreetly erases its indiscretions. It doesn't let you know everything it's been doing, right? But our devices are deceptively sealed, deceptively personal. But our devices, our computers constantly leak. They're wonderfully creepy. And this leaking is not accidental because without this constant writing back and forth, without this constant exchange of information, there would be no communication. There would be no internet. Having said this, though, I want to stress that although this exchange is necessary, it's not necessary that it be stored, right? It's not necessary for it to be constantly read and written forward and compared with other traces. There's a difference between memory and storage, between capture and capture. So if TCP/IP has become key to surveillance, it's not because of the inherent nature of the technology, but rather due to political decisions to store and secure. That is, political decisions to reduce trust to authenticity. So in other words, if the internet has become a space of surveillance, it's because this strange imagining of the internet, no one knows you're a dog, has been replaced by an equally strange notion of the internet. The internet is a semi-private space of true names and true images. And in this semi-private space, freedom stems from knowing who's a dog, right? And who isn't. The authentic, in other words, increasingly stems from the privately authenticating, from what I call in the book use value. It's because of the post-dot bomb transformation of the internet into a series of poorly gated communities. A series of poorly gated communities that put us at greatest risk precisely because they offer us the illusion of boundaries, the illusion of logins and privacy. And they also make it seem as if the worst danger came from strangers, right? Stranger danger as the thing that needs to be mitigated against, right? Rather than friends, right? And there's a knife-edge difference between friend and enemy, right? And from friendship come the greatest betrayals. So part 2, updating participation. So new media has become new media, right? New media is a function of you. New media relentlessly emphasize you, what's on your mind. You are new media, YouTube, etc. Now you in the English language is a particularly shifty shifter, right? Because you is both singular and plural, but when I address you as a plural, I still individuate you as you, right? It's not a bunch of I's become we's, right? It's not we versus they, it's you and you. And this is allegedly good because you're no longer silent, you're always individuated, you can participate, hence John Perry Barlow, hence new media is good. Okay, but to state the obvious, since the emergence of the internet as a mass medium to end mass media, participation does not automatically equal freedom or democracy, right? So we need to ask ourselves, why and how did freedom and democracy become reducible to participation, where participation, true participation, is allegedly marked by the production of difference. So allegedly, the more difference out there, the more democracy. So therefore, the presence of the nastiest comments become evidence or proof of democracy. Now, the concept of participation or difference as empowering stems from what has become a rather standard critique of mass media, a standard critique from both the right and the left that links silence with oppression, brainwashing, and hence participation with liberation. And here you see Stuart Hall's influential and inspiring critique of standard theories of mass media. Standard theories that assume that encoding equals decoding, that mass media means it succeeds when it's transparent. And against this theory, he revealed the differences between encoding and decoding. He revealed how communication is a process, how resistance, opposition could happen at the level of reception, although importantly, different interpretations were not themselves oppositional. But his point here is that the production of such oppositional readings, moments in which events which are normally signified and decoded in a negotiated way can be given an oppositional reading, these are moments of crisis. Now, Hall's point is subtle and inspiring, and if I return to him now to think through the limitations of the argument, it's not to dismiss him, but rather to engage him. And as I always tell my students, critique isn't going for that one false thing or the one thing you really disagree with in a reading so you can just toss it away. Critique is actually taking what you think is true, that moment you find yourself nodding the most, and trying to figure out its limitations and possibilities. So it's in this vein I ask the question, does this still hold? For new media, run on differences. Algorithms need mistakes, deviations in order to learn. Singular events, singularities, these crises aren't exceptions, but rather opportunities to improve. They feed the algorithm. Crisis plus habit equals update. Deviations are encouraged rather than discouraged. Decoding drives encoding. So to get to this and rethink the assumption that silence is bad, a sign of alienation or cowardice, I want to turn to Jean Baudrillard at his most perverse. This is the Jean Baudrillard of In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities and the Masses, the implosion of the social and the media. And I want to revisit this Baudrillard not to decide whether silence is good or bad, but to ask the question, is silence still possible? Is silence still possible? So Baudrillard, in these two texts, in his usual understated manner, for all of you who read him, argues that the strength of the masses lies in their silence. So rather than taking the silence of the masses as a problem to be fixed, he views this non-response as a form of resistance. So a strategic resistance, strategic disappearance that reacts to the demand to be liberated, rational subjects, to be enlightened, by refusing choice and rationality altogether. So the masses, he argues, are an opaque yet translucent reality. They're anonymous, innumerable, and unnameable. Although the masses, the majority, are constantly poked and prodded, that is, surveyed and measured, they're fundamentally unknown and unknowable because they're a black hole, right? They lie outside of representation, they absorb and neutralize rather than radiate. And again, this absorption, this indifference, is a positive strategy, Baudrillard argues. It's impossible for the masses to be alienated because this silence indicates the refusal to be subjects. It's a silence that refuses to be spoken for in its name. In other words, the strength of the masses themselves, a medium called into being through media, the strength of mass medium is their lack of verifiable reception, their lack of verifiable reception, their lack of vocal participation. This, of course, was once just called reading. And here you see D.A. Miller's description of the ontological difference between readers and characters. Now, whether or not one agrees or disagrees with Baudrillard, and there's a lot to disagree with here. It's unclear for me, for instance, how one of his examples of silence is the mass watching of a football game. Right? So I think he has some issues around indifference and silence that need to be thought through, right? But silence as a mocking strategy, as a positive brutality, is arguably now impossible, precisely due to those constant measures for testing that Baudrillard dismisses as incapable of actually capturing the masses because they're on the side of simulation and representation. So silence is now impossible, not because of the implosion of the social in the media, but rather because of the implosion of the media in the social. Because of the rise of social media in which reception is automatically coupled with response, in which reading is no longer private but tracked, in which even when silent, even when you're silent, you're constantly betrayed by people like you, because the medium is no longer the mass, but you. So new media is new media, not simply because you're always chattering, but also because of how your reception, how you're captured and compared, how your deviation from the medium is measured and appraised, that is valued. So in many ways, the whole rhetoric around empowerment, security, and transparency has been exposed as a farce. Not simply because we can all now speak and yet the world is not yet right, but also because what matters is arguably not what we say, but how we cannot not say things even when we're silent, right? So consider, how many of you all read on Kindle? Right? Kindle, here you are. Consider what happens when you read a book on Kindle. Your highlights are tabulated, used to create lists of the most highlighted texts, used to link to others like you. Even the time you spend on a page is measured, right? Okay, but what's more interesting, and the point I'd like to dwell on here, is that silence is impossible, not only because we're constantly being captured, but also because we're constantly being compared to people who like us and who are like us, right? So friends knit us more closely into networks. Through their actions, they make clear the ties, the weights between the nodes. So the internet as big data relies on modes of liking and unliking. Right. So part 3, like, or the revenge of the Valley Girl. Now, this notion of friends as knitting us more closely to networks is intimately intertwined with notions of virality, the idea that everything spreads like a virus. Now, recent work on virality has been important, but it tends to privilege everything. Everything becomes a virus. Everything spreads virally, right? So consider this infamous study on how obesity spreads like a virus, right? And this study has come under attack for many reasons. Most compelling has been this article by Shalishi and Thomas, which shows that these models generally confound contagion and homophily. So it's very difficult mathematically to know the difference between contagion and the tendency of people who are like each other in the same circumstances to act alike. Right? So it's difficult to distinguish between viral spread and habituation. And habituation often dampens viral spread. Right? And as we're told over and over again, if you want to avoid a virus, acquire the habit of washing your hands. Right? So habit is attenuating and storing affect. So I'd like to think here not only of people who like us, but people who are like us. And the work that this like does in terms of defining you as a medium. So the work that this like does in making reality analog. So it's always really struck me as bizarre that analog, which comes from the term analogy, has become the term to describe the real world, the real thing, right? And this is in part due to the erasure of analog computing, which operated by setting up an analogous model. But with network analytics, the analog is returning with a vengeance. Everything is like everything else. This is what I'm calling the revenge of the like Valley Girl. And this like is being used to draw links between disparate folks, to create networks of affinity by correlating habits. To scale social networks by combining individual ticks to larger social phenomenon. So consider, for instance, Netflix's use of collaborative filtering, right? So Netflix has a huge database. It has millions of subscribers and films. At the same time, its database of recommendations is really sparse, right? Millions of subscribers, millions of films, but not that many recommendations. So most don't rate films at all, or some rate a lot of them. This is the so-called power law, right? So Netflix famously posted a challenge. Here you're seeing the rules. It offered a large chunk of its database and a lot of money to whoever could improve on its recommendation system. And this is nicely outlined in Meng Chung's textbook, Net Worth Life. Now, the winning algorithm not only took at its base the mean score, right? You average everything and figure out the mean score, and compensate for user and movie bias, it also created a neighborhood predictor based on strong similarities and strong dissimilarities between films. That is based on how and where films and you deviated most from the norm became crucial to predicting your behavior. Now, intriguingly, Netflix is not implementing the algorithm in all its complexity, but rather focusing on principal component analysis, on figuring out. So here's a rough diagram of what. So that space is sort of the space of all the films and the users, and they shift it, and then what they do is they try to find the axes that could describe the space, right? So things like violence, time since last rating, et cetera, et cetera. And I bring up big data and the Netflix algorithm because I think they raise the question, what does it mean to engage in cultural analytics in the age of networks, right? And one answer they provide is to follow the logic of networks, to use its data and its methods, to fall into the network and its modes of tracing. And I think this is one answer that we do need to take seriously, and I'm personally fascinated with it. So once habitual new media is done, once I no longer have to update it, I'm going to stop writing books for a while, go back to my engineering textbooks, and go back to numerical methods. But I must say, it's not something I ever enjoyed. So as an engineer, I perversely loved partial differential equations. My partner and I met in grad school when I gave him my partial differential equations textbook. And I always loved the beauty of an analytic solution, right? And so it's bizarre to me that numerical methods, which were defined against analytic solutions, are now called analytics. Right? What's happening? And also think about noise. Something is fundamentally happening with the notion of noise. Noise was before something you filtered out. Now noise is something you have to selectively reintroduce, right? So for instance, one web app that you can have to give you privacy, what it does is it generates random websites. So the idea is by adding randomness to your data trail, you're somehow less trackable, right? But also think the other way, Target. Everyone's heard the famous story about how Target knew a girl was pregnant before her father did. And then father got very angry, said, why are you sending my 16-year-old daughter pregnancy coupons? And it's like, well, hello. So now what Target does is they mix in random coupons, right? So you get the, baby diapers next to, I don't know, condoms, but they might be related. Anyway, sorry. But did you see, you just sort of throw in bizarre and random things. So noise now, not something to be filtered, but rather to be selectively added. Okay, but to think through possible futures, we also need to consider ways of inhabiting rather than following networks. Moves that perhaps resist this like precisely because they inhabit it. And so I'd like to end with the work of Natalie Bookchin. And I'll just show you part of her really wonderful piece, Mass Ornament.
lullaby of old
Mass ornament and her other piece, Testament, which I'm happy to show you in the question in A, are amazing examples of what Jamie Barron has found collectivity. So unlike network analytics, this found collectivity is not algorithmically generated. So it's not an algorithm that finds this. I think it's what's called graduate students. She has a lot of graduates in going through this. So through this manual sifting, mass ornament captures our neoliberal condition in which we're all allegedly individuals and in which the private corporations, individual rights, etc., seems to have triumphed over the public or the social. And importantly, mass ornament starts with clips of private spaces, of screens and mirrors. This brilliant reworking of Siegfried Kraucauer's reading of the 1920s chorus line as reflecting the logic of Fordism, right? So the rows of dancers neatly mapped with the nice rows of you all in matching lines. Yes, yes. Uses rows of YouTube videos to reveal collective habituation in our most intimate moments. Indeed, focused on action shot in the home, mass ornament is not simply a negative critique. It's not like, hey, we're all the same and this is bad, but rather also a hopeful revelation of the traces of publicity that form our habits and our seemingly private revelations. For habit, the traces of publicity encased within the self. Habit is traces of publicity encased within the self, are arguably what society can be in an era in which allegedly there is no society. So since I'm running out of time, let me just note that habit as culture becomes second nature is that which is at the threshold between nature and culture, is wonderfully paradoxical and contradictory, spontaneous and repetitive, individual and collective, human and non-human, creative and ideological. That is, in an era in which improbability, speculation, etc. drives capitalism, drives everybody to think different so we can be more easily tracked and like it. Perhaps what's most radical is the revelation of probability. These pieces are so forceful because they point towards the many thousands of videos that could have been used. They're so forceful because they're moments of found habituation as much as they're moments of found collectivity. They reveal traces of the medium as medium in what's become social media. They reveal that what matters isn't difference from the medium, but rather moments of medium inhabitation. Moments that are not simply banal, but also moments of network shutdown, of crowds and hugs that can destroy. Thank you.